feature presentation.
How are you, Sean? Nice to meet you.
It's a hell of a collection you got behind you there.
Yeah, well, actually, I kind of wanted to start off with that because I just saw you recently in a post for the Criterion Collection, and I think that's a place where every film lover, whether they're young or old, want to end up one day and going through it. And in that photo, you're holding both Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull and Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. And I wanted to ask you if those two films had an influence in shaping the narrative or the atmosphere of the Iron Claw, because in the opening sequence it feels very much like a film noir, but then having seen that photo, it also reminds me a little bit of the opening credits of Raging Bull when we see De Niro in the boxing ring, and the way that you frame Holt McElhaney as Fritz von Erich. It has this kind of menacing air to it, but also a kind of tragedy underneath the belly of the surface of that sort of genre.
Yeah, you've revealed my secrets. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know, in that closet, there's just endless amounts of good film. But I would say that I would say the three key influences, if I had to boil it down, are The Deer Hunter, Raging Bull, and Dazed and Confused. And I wanted to make something sort of inspired by all of those all at once. And so, yeah, just looking at those that tightrope of violence and masculinity and vulnerability, brotherhood, friendship, loss, family, complicated brothers, all of those things are present in all of those movies in very different ways and different lights, but they all inspired me, which is why I was holding those two. They don't
Yeah,
have
and
Deer Hunter, unfortunately, but
no, yeah, and I know with Michelle Cimino, like Heaven's Gate is available, and hopefully maybe one point, because Universal still has the rights to Deer Hunter, and they've released it
is that what
multiple
it is?
times. And I think Shout Factory actually released Deer Hunter on 4K not too long ago, because they also helped release The Nest, which I think is an incredible movie and it's so underrated. And I wanted to ask you about the process of making this movie, 3 years after The Nest, because it almost took a decade between Martha, Marcy May, Marlene, and The Nest to get to The Nest. And now with this, you only have 3 years between the Iron Claw and The Nest. And I was curious, in terms of the process of making this film, if you had any sort of pushback from the WWF, because we hear so much about narrative features about Hulk Hogan with Netflix and Chris Hemsworth, or Tom Hardy playing Vince McMahon, and there kind of seems to be a little bit of like a taboo quality, or even Lexi Alexander wanting to do a Chris Benoit film.
Um, we didn't go through the WWF at all, and I think that probably, we stayed out of it. We formed our own path, and I think that probably helped. In terms of timing, between finishing, I made a show in England called Southcliffe, which took a couple of years, and between finishing Southcliffe and making the Nest was 5 years. So it wasn't quite as long as it seemed. But in that time, I also wrote The Nest. Started writing The Iron Claw, tried to make some other films too that didn't happen. But so it's like all of this stuff is happening side by side. Like, but when I went to shoot The Nest, I'd already done 2 drafts of The Iron Claw, and then made The Nest, took a year off, and then came back to Iron Claw. So everything is sort of side by side, and I often find that in the writing process, where I'll write something, I'll work on it for a year, and then I won't look at it for a year. Got a couple of things that I'm exactly in that condition right now that I'm gonna come back to once the film's out, kind of, so it's all staggered. It's never one thing then the other. And
Do you think
it's so interesting because like they also share a lot of ideas, they share a lot of themes, and it's interesting to like find those themes that I'm interested in and see how they take form in very different places, whether it's the family and the Nest, or the family and in the Iron Claw. There couldn't be more different, yet there's something bubbling under the surface in both. It's very similar.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you mentioned that because the familial themes, even in Martha, Marcy, May, Marlene, of a makeshift family or the estrangement between Elizabeth Olsen and Sarah Paulson's characters, and you mentioned Southcliffe, which I think is such an underrated miniseries and also played at TIFF. And there's something about that film that is tragically so relevant even now. And going to the Iron Claw, you mentioned that you take time between drafts and go from one project to another. Do you think that that helps a little bit in terms of moving away from it and seeing it maybe with refreshed eyes in terms of looking at how a project is shaped?
Always, always. Also, um, a certain amount of life happens in a year away. And so something like, from from the time I started to outline the Iron Claw to making it, I've had two kids, and even that is, so when I'm editing the Iron Claw, I have a different perspective than when I was outlining the Iron Claw because of life that I've lived in between. And so everything feeds in. Those breaks for writers, for me, I find is key to getting some perspective and also seeing what you're still interested in. Sometimes your interests just change. You get a little older and you're like, oh, I'm not interested in that part. This is the part I'm really interested in. And so, yeah, it's fascinating process.
Did your perspective on wrestling change throughout writing the script and directing the movie to when you first started the project? Because even in the press notes you talk very much about being a fan of wrestling and also understanding the communal experience of watching the sport with two people and one you're rooting for. It's very much like watching a movie where you feed off the audience as much as the what you're watching in front of you.
Yeah. I would say that my feelings about wrestling didn't really change, or it wasn't about like learning anything. It was more about just like a deepening of understanding. Like I knew conceptually how hard the life of a wrestler was, and um I only know it more now. I still don't know it, like, and so it's that kind of thing. It's just like everything just sort of got deeper and heavier, and just like understanding changes. Even standing in a ring, like I'd never stood in a ring before. Even standing in the ring and trying to bounce off the ropes and realizing how painful a single bounce off the ropes can be,
Yeah.
uh, is just, even that just like gives insight of like, wow, like what these guys do night after night with no break, no protection. It's no wonder so many wrestlers end up the way they end up.
Well, even just the practice, like landing on your back and then
Yeah.
getting back up, it's incredible the endurance that these incredible athletes have. And I have to wrap up with you, but I just quickly wanted to ask you, you just mentioned a little bit about that changing of perspective and sort of how looking at it from the point of view of a filmmaker. What was your feelings of watch or having Kevin watch the film, and what were you feeling when he was sort of seeing the final cut of the movie before its release?
Um, so Kevin and I uh, um, developed a really strong relationship over the course of. I approached him when we were, I don't know, we were a couple months before we started shooting, and just to talk him through it, and while he didn't read the script or see footage or anything, his kids came down to set. There it was very much a communication, and so I would talk him through things that were happening. We would talk about things that were happening. So by the time we got to the actual screening, um, the day before, we did this big family Zoom where they all got together and they Zoomed me because I was like, okay, any questions you guys want to ask? I want to give you some, headlines of things that I've cut and directions that I went in. And I was all like nervous for that conversation. And then they were just like, understood anything I said, and they were just like, we know. They got it. They're like, you can't tell, a movie is a movie. It's never gonna tell the full story. That's okay. Like your heart's in it. And they sort of knew at that point how my heart was in the right place, and how passionate I was about it. And they've just been so accepting. So when they actually saw the movie, I wasn't nervous. It was more the conversation before, because I kind of knew how they would respond, but it was an incredible feeling when they responded the way they did, which was that they love the movie, they've supported it. they're moved by it, and just like really, really love it. It's become a really wonderful relationship.
I know I have to wrap, but I just quickly wanted to touch on that because you mentioned the nervousness.
Yeah.
Was part of that with also amalgamating Chris Von Erich a little bit into sort of Mike and Carrie's narrative?
Yeah, that was one of the things. That was the big, that's sort of the biggest headline. I mean, there were others too. Like David had a daughter that died. Carrie's kids and wife were not depicted. Like those are just as big to me in telling the family. Kevin and Pam had daughters before they had sons. And that's really meaningful on a family level when I start to know people really well. And so it was all it was all really difficult, but it was always like, you have to make these choices because you have to service the core of the film. You have to find what the core of the film is because it's such a big story, and the core of this film is, and the core of the story is Kevin's survival and celebrating the brothers, celebrating the family, but also how does Kevin survive and break these trends of masculinity that really ultimately, his brothers did not survive.
Absolutely. Sean, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And especially at the end there, I really, really do appreciate it because I think it is something a lot of people are talking about. And to hear you, talk about it so eloquently and very much, tenderly and thoughtfully is really opening in terms of that. And always looking forward to your films, but also as a producer as well. I hope James White gets a Blu-ray release at some point, and that James Bond also, or Josh Bond also gets a chance to direct again, because I've been waiting for his follow-up. So.
Yeah, that'd be great on James White.